coming through here with the stage line, there'd be dead bodies along the road. So they would bury them just to kind of keep them out of the public eye, even though I don't know if graves help much. Bigfoot. Or a bear. Good morning. I'm down in the desert today in southern New Mexico. I am just south of Cooke's Peak in the Cooke's Range, and I'm doing some coyote calling and some quail hunting and stuff. But there is a ton of history in this area, so even though I usually don't show the whole world where I hunt, this isn't like a secret spot or anything. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the history because there is a ton of it right here in this area, and it's a pretty cool little area. So right up here is Cooke's Peak. I'm pretty much at Fort Cummings right now. We'll get to that. That's part of the history. But let me show you around. All of this history in the area started because of this right here. So this is Cooke Spring, and it's a pretty reliable water source, and it's been a water source forever. The way that it got its name was there was a guy that his name was Philip St. George Cooke, and he was an officer in the army, and he was in charge of the Mormon Battalion, or part of the Mormon Battalion. So what that was as the Mormon pioneers were headed across the plains, the army needed people to come for the Mexican-American War. And what they really needed was somebody to figure out a southern route, because they were worried in the wintertime they wouldn't be able to get across how they normally were. So they went to Brigham Young, who was in charge at the time. And so the army asked him for people to be kind of like volunteers, but they were paid to serve in the army. And they ended up getting 5 units of 100 men each. So the total was 543 of them. And they even brought some women along. I think there were 33 or so. And then some of their kids to help with laundry and cooking and things like that. And their whole job was to find a southern route for the Mexican-American War, because they were worried that they wouldn't be able to cross further north. So they came down here. They came down through the Camino Real, so down the Rio Grande. And this is one of the water sources that they found. So they named it after Cooke because he was in charge of them. And the funny thing is, people don't realize, from what I can tell reading a bunch of stuff, they didn't really like him. Like, Cooke didn't like the Mormons didn't like Cooke, but yet they named Cooke Spring, which then later Cooke's Peak, Cooke's Canyon, all of this stuff after him. And from what I understand, he wasn't here when they initially found it. So this march, it was actually the longest military march in history. And so they were sending out scouts and stuff. Remember, there's 600 of them pretty much, or more altogether. And so they would send out scouts, and it took them a long time. And in a lot of ways it was rough, but it was good because the army was paying them. These pioneers they didn't have anything to their name really. So the government was paying them. They actually ended up giving most of it to their families before they even left. And then they came on this huge march. A bunch of people died. It was a pretty rough ordeal, but they paved the way out west through the southern route. Most of those pioneers, they went from Iowa all the way to California, and most of them ended up breaking off once they were done and going to Utah with their families. Some of them settled in California. Some of them settled other places along the way. And so it was a pretty big deal. But they were the first groundbreakers, I guess, for this area. So after the Mormon Battalion came through here, this was in 1846 and 47 is when that happened. The next thing that came through was the Butterfield stagecoach line. The government put out a proposal for anybody who wanted to get a contract to make a southern route to deliver military mail. And the only takers was John Butterfield. And the contract was for $600,000 a year, guaranteed. And then he could make money off of transporting people across the West. So he took it. Nobody else did, because it was a crazy feat. So it went from St. Louis to California, and it was about 2,700 miles long. And it's just crazy to think about, but they sent out some scouts and they started making stage stops, and they ended up making one right here at this water, because it was the only water between the Rio Grande and the Members River, which is just to the west of us here. And so it made sense for them to make this a stop. And they're the ones that kind of developed it and kind of made it into what it is today. John Butterfield he already had a stage line back east, but he didn't have the money or anything like that to get this thing going. So he had to borrow a bunch of money with investors. He ended up needing about $1 million, and they ended up with, initially they had to get 1,500 horses and mules to pull wagons, and then they needed to make stage stops, and they ended up with 153 or 150, something like that, stage stops. And in this area, so the trail came up from El Paso to Mesilla, and then it went over by Picacho Peak, and then it came across Aquila Flats to here, and then over to the Members, and then kind of the White Signal area, and then over into Arizona, ended up like by Tucson. So that's kind of this stretch. But normally they would try to keep the stage stops between 15 and upwards of 40 miles apart, and they were pretty much trotting the whole way, which was pretty crazy. They had it set up by 1858, and the first run that they made, the government told them that it had to be done in 25 days, which to me is crazy, but they made it faster than that. So they would run, and they even got faster as the trail got better. So they would travel day and night, and they would just swap out every stage stop. They'd get fresh mules or horses, and they would just keep going. And I couldn't imagine how brutal of a ride that would be. And it's one of those old stagecoaches, but they could do it. So the Mormon Battalion, it took them months, and they didn't even go quite as far. Then once they got all of this figured out, they could make it in 23, 24 days. So it's just pretty impressive to me. The stage line would come from the spring there up around, and then it would come up this canyon right here. And this is Cooke's Canyon, but there's a nickname they called it Massacre Canyon. So there's a bunch of Massacre Canyons all over the place. This is one of them. if you wanted to ride the Butterfield stage line, you would pay $200. Well, that was to go all the way through, but most people didn't go all the way through. They would get off at different points along the way and get on. So just like any other transit system. But it was $200, and it was recommended that you carry a Spencer carbine with 100 cartridges and a Navy revolver with 2 pounds of shot or of bullets. And big part of that was because of this canyon right here behind me. So they would have to come up here, and the problem was it's flat. This is kind of the start of the hills, and so Apaches, and there's a bunch of, over the years, this was, you know, 1858 when it started until really into the 1870s and 1880s after the Apache wars. But the Apaches could get up on these peaks all around. They would see the stage coming, and then they would ambush them right here. And so whenever you read about this, which I recommend you do, you're gonna hear like Cochise and Mancos, Colorado, and all these really famous, even Victorio a little bit, all these famous Apache warriors, and they would ambush people right here in this canyon, which is the perfect spot. Like I said, you could get up on any of these hills and you would see them coming for 2 days. So you could get ready, and then they're kind of boxed in here and trapped. Part of getting attacked by Apaches was that they didn't bury the dead. And they were pretty brutal about everything. And they would just leave the bodies lie. But there was the stagecoach was coming through here, or people were traveling west, and there would just be dead bodies on the ground. So they would bury them, kind of to respect the dead and to keep them out of the public eye. And here are a few, and I don't know, it's possible that these ones were recreated, but from what I understand, there were hundreds of these just buried where they were. And then the fort comes into play with that here in a little bit whenever I go back over there. But there are a few of them right here, and it used to just kind of line the road, which, could you imagine? It'd be like getting on a Greyhound and they said, make sure you take a gun with you. It might get a little rough at some points. Good luck. There's another pinch point right here and more graves. So I don't know if you see a pattern here. Every time they get pinched down, there are graves on the road. And you made it down into those flats, you're pretty good for a while. The next really deadly place was over in Arizona. So you're safe for, a few days. But a lot of the accounts of the Butterfield say that this was the scariest part of the whole trip right here, was through this canyon, and the most treacherous. So if you're strong enough to ride in a wagon or a stagecoach that long and you made it through here, you're doing pretty good. Do you think this is some kind of old ruin, or do you think this is kids messing around that were camped out here? The Butterfield Trail only stayed in operation for about 3 years. But it was at a time where they were trying to open up the West, and then the Civil War started, and so that kind of put a damper on things. But one of the big factors was the Pony Express, which ran, you know, kind of through the middle of the country. They could make it faster than they could on the Butterfield to deliver mail. And so there wasn't really a need anymore, but the trail stayed open. Well, it's still, people are still using it today. So trail stayed open forever, and so it played a huge part in westward expansion. Timeline wise, the Mormon Battalion came through, then the Butterfield, and then a bunch of other travelers. But before that, way like thousands of years before that, or 1,000 years, there were Native Americans here, and they like to ride on rocks. And so I'm at a spot where there's a bunch of petroglyphs, so we'll go check that out a little bit. I came over the pass of Cooke's Canyon, dropped down. The Butterfield Trail just keeps going on through these flats and around. You can see dimming down there. But up here on the hill, there's a bunch of these around. Our writings, those ones aren't real clear. But petroglyphs just covering this place. What's that? Some kind of deer running looking thing. These walls are just covered in them. I'm pretty sure that one's fresh, some knucklehead carving in it. I don't know why people do stuff like that. Bigfoot. Or a bear. This one almost looks, there's a Spanish gold sign that kind of looks like that, but it's two picks. I don't think that's, maybe there's Spanish gold here. I don't know what this is. A lot of times when I find these, there's usually, you know, just a couple, 2 or 3, maybe 5 of them. There are a ton in this area, and there's a lot of well-documented sites. And it makes you wonder, did they have some teenagers up here on lookout, and they would just get really bored, so they'd start scratching in the rocks? It's my theory anyways. At a place like this, I don't think it could be anything meaningful because there's so many of them. So it's not directions or anything like that. Maybe I'm wrong. Pretty high chance of that. They last a while though. So hopefully they're here in a few more 100 years. Maybe it was their version of school. They had all the kids, they gave them a rock and said, okay, you're gonna go carve symbols in the rocks. And way up here. Sun or a big old fat tick? Pretty cool. Maybe there was a Sasquatch around here. What is that? Is that somebody proposing? I don't know. This one is super common and it's all different sizes. So I wonder if it was when the Spaniards were here and they were marking, they saw Spaniards or something like that. Their version of tic-tac-toe. If you wind up in this area, this is definitely worth checking out. And there's a bunch of these sites in this around. And this actually isn't the most popular one. There's one that has a little bit better road access that you can get to. But it's fun to try to guess what was going on and what they were trying to say or what they were doing. These ones are at the bottom. Those petroglyphs are just there behind me, and there's this canyon here. It's called Frying Pan. I've never been up it. Been on all the other stuff that I've walked through today. So I figure there's supposed to be a spring up here. Go check it out. We'll just go on a little adventure somewhere I've never been before. It might be something crazy up there, so we'll go check it out. Oh. I don't think people understand the value of ranchers in this area. So for one, they're feeding the world off of nothing. So you gotta give them props to that. But then they're putting water sources in for wildlife, and without water out here, nothing would be here. And so thank you if you're a rancher in the Chihuahuan Desert, or any desert, I guess. But yeah, I don't think people understand the magnitude of that. I walked up Frying Pan. There's a spring in the bottom, didn't have any water. This tank is turned off, probably for the winter. Nothing too crazy, but all of those rock outcroppings, there are petroglyphs kind of scattered throughout. I didn't walk up there, I just kind of looked through my binoculars. So now I'm going to head back towards the ruins, and it's going to be kind of the same deal, so I'm probably just catch you down there. I'm back to pretty much the fort, and there's this old rock wall here, and there's some more over here. I'm not really sure what era this is from. I don't know if this is part of the stagecoach, or if this is later, or if this is even way more recent. But if I had to guess, I bet this had something to do with the Butterfield. I had to get out of the wind, so I'm tucked away, but right over the hill from here is where old Fort Cummings was. And so Fort Cummings was built in 1863. And you have to remember that the whole purpose of the Butterfield the main purpose was to transport mail and information for the military. So, and then everything else was just a kind of a byproduct. So they built this fort because there were so many people getting attacked up there in Massacre Canyon to protect them. But the Butterfield stopped in 1861, and so they were a little bit behind. In 1863, it had huge walls, and they had whitewashed it, so it stuck out like a sore thumb. And it worked. Around that time, the Apaches weren't as hostile, and they weren't having the problems that they were having in the past. Then the Civil War happened, and a lot of the resources went to the Civil War. But in 1867, it became one of the forts for the Buffalo Soldiers. So the Buffalo Soldiers used it, And then by 1873, they just stopped using it altogether. And it just kind of sat abandoned. And then in 1880, they were having problems with Victorio. So kind of like Massacre Canyon, the last video I did. And so they put soldiers back there again, and they kept them for a while that time. So Fort Cummings had 10-foot high walls, and there was no exterior windows, and it was pretty fortified. In 1935, they finally put it on the historic registry, where they considered it a historic place, and now it's just ruins. And they're trying their best to maintain it or keep it historically accurate. They're doing some reclamation work, kind of just more of like a preservation type thing, just so that way it completely doesn't erode, because it was made out of adobe, so adobe washes away in the rain. I had to get here tucked out of the wind again, because I don't think you could hear anything. But something interesting, and I'm not sure how true it is, so this might just be completely me making it up, so do your research on everything that I say. But in the late 1800s, they'd use heliographs, which is a mirror on a big tripod. And I know that they used them a lot in Arizona, and somebody told me once that there was one over by White Signal, so I'm assuming that they would have had one here, because it's the perfect place across these flats to relay information. So they'd get this big mirror and they'd reflect the light, and it's kind of like Morse code, and they could shoot them, you know, till the next mountain, really, so 30-40 miles, whatever, and somebody would be watching with binoculars, and then they would pass it on. So something that would normally take a couple weeks to get a message across, they could do it really fast, just within a few minutes. So this would be the perfect place if you got up on one of these mountains somewhere to use that. I've never read it. I've never heard anybody say it. It might be something that's common knowledge that I just don't know about, but it's just something that I found interesting. If you did it from the top of Cooke's Peak, you could go a long ways. The structure around Cooke Spring was made by the railroad company, because once everything was starting to get settled, the railroad was coming, and so they needed water, and so Cooke Spring was the closest water. So the railroad company made a deal, and part of it was they're going to build a structure around it, and they did, and then Apaches came and tore it down, and then it was rebuilt, and then eventually it was restored in 1987. So it's at the state that it's at now since 1987. It's still a good source of water. They're still using it for ranching and stuff like that. It looks just like desert with nothing, but a lot happened over the years. I could spend a whole day talking about each one of these little things, but it'd bore you to death. The Mormon Battalion, Fort Cummings, Cooke Spring, all of that stuff. There's just so much. But I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for making it all the way to the end. You can drive here. You could probably get your Subaru here if you wanted. Or if you have one of those tiny little trucks that four-wheeler companies make, you can drive all the way up the canyon. But thanks for watching. I've spent my whole life staring at Cooke's Peak right here. I've never been to the top. I wouldn't consider myself a violent person, but I could punch somebody in the face. TMS,